While the United States was the largest single recipient of Italian immigrants during the era of mass emigration, it was also receiving vast numbers of immigrants from other countries as well. This alone meant that the Italian impact on American society was not likely to be as dramatic as the impact of Italian immigrants in Argentina or Brazil. Moreover, the native-born American population was both larger and already relatively well endowed with the industrial and commercial skills and aptitudes that were so lacking in societies where Italian immigrants supplied these key elements of economic modernization. Finally, Italian immigrants to the United States came overwhelmingly from the more backward southern part of Italy. Despite all this, however, Italian immigrants played a significant role in American social history and included individuals who rose to national stature in a number of fields. Italian immigrants were among the last and largest waves of immigrants from Europe. The mass exodus from famine-stricken Ireland to the United States in the middle of the 19th century exceeded 200,000 people in only one year, 1851, while Italian immigration exceeded that total in 8 different years during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Only the mass exodus of Jews from Eastern Europe to the United States during the same era was at all comparable in size. Altogether, more than 5 million Italians immigrated to the United States between 1876 and 1930. Of these, about 2 million returned to Italy. Despite a preponderance of males over females among Italian immigrants, the still greater preponderance of males among those who returned to Italy led to a lessening imbalance between the sexes among those remaining in the United States. While there were well over 3 times as many males as females among Italian immigrants, the ratio was less than 2 to 1 among the resident Italian-American population as early as 1910. With the passing years, especially after the virtual cutoff of immigration from Italy in the 1920s, the sexes became balanced. In the era before mass emigration from Italy, those Italians who came to the United States were largely from the northern provinces. The total Italian population officially recorded in the United States in 1850 was less than 4,000 persons. By 1880, there were more than 44,000, and by 1900, there were 484,027. Between 1880 and 1900, Southern Italians became predominant among the immigrants from Italy, and remained so as the immigrant tide swelled in the 20th century. A predominantly agricultural people in Italy, the immigrants became predominantly urban in the United States, which no longer had the abundance of cheap land still found in Argentina or Brazil. In the cities, previous waves of immigrants had occupied other economic niches and neighborhoods, so that Italians became part of a more general pattern of ethnic succession in occupations, housing, schools, and even organized crime, which was dominated by Irish and Jewish gangsters before Italian gangsters began to take over during the 1920s. Because of the natural increase of other groups who had immigrated earlier, even the record-breaking immigration from Italy in the early 20th century seldom made the Italians the largest foreign origin group in American cities, with New York and New Orleans being notable exceptions. In no other major American city were Italians either the largest or the second largest immigrant group. Italian immigrants, at their peak, were just 1.5% of the U.S. population, compared to 3% of the total population of Brazil and 12.5% of the Argentine population. In New York City, Italians were 7.4% of the population, compared to 20% in Buenos Aires and 35% in Sao Paulo. In one respect, however, Italian immigrants to the United States were very much like Italians who settled in South America. These immigrants typically began at the very bottom of the occupational ladder. Out of 474 foreign bootblacks in New York toward the end of the 19th century, 473 were Italians. Italians were also prominent among rag pickers, sewer workers, and in whatever other hard, dirty, dangerous, or menial jobs others disdained. Italian children worked at an early age, as in Italy, even at the expense of their education. But Italians seldom accepted charity or resorted to prostitution, as some other immigrant groups, such as the Irish, did. This, too, reflected patterns that went back to Italy. Both in 1880 and in 1905, approximately 3/4 of the Italians working in New York City were blue-collar workers, with most of the remainder being peddlers, shopkeepers, and barbers. More than half the barbers in New York at that time were Italian. While the proportion of blue-collar workers was broadly similar to that in Buenos Aires, in the latter city significantly more of these were skilled workers. Moreover, the remainder in Buenos Aires included more owners of small industrial and commercial establishments rather than peddlers and barbers. High white-collar occupations were rare for Italians in both cities, but higher, 4%, in Buenos Aires than in New York, 2%. In New York, as in Buenos Aires and other cities in other countries, Italians settled in clusters related to their places of origin in Italy. Not only did Neapolitans and Sicilians settle in different parts of New York, people from different parts of Sicily clustered on different streets. The settling of Italians from particular towns in Italy on particular streets in American cities was also a pattern found in San Francisco, Chicago, New Haven, Cleveland, Buffalo, Kansas City, and Rochester, among other places. What was seldom created in the United States, however, were all Italian enclaves, rural or urban. Few Italians became rural in America, and in the cities there were seldom any all-Italian neighborhoods. Rather, Italians typically lived interspersed among other immigrant groups, such as the Irish, the Jews, the Germans, and Poles, even though the particular Italians interspersed in a given section might be predominantly from one province or village in Italy. Initially, both in Chicago and in San Francisco, marriages among Italians were primarily between people whose families had originated in the same province or village in Italy. Eventually, in the second generation and later, marriages began to occur among people from different geographical origins in Italy and also with non-Italians. Italians, however, were much slower than other groups to intermarry. In 1920, 97% of Italian men in the United States had Italian wives. This was particularly true of Southern Italians, especially those from smaller communities. As late as 1950, more than three-quarters of Italian marriages were with other Italians. While immigrants from various parts of Italy might settle in the same American city, it was also true that different parts of the United States had different proportions of people from particular parts of Italy. Italians in New Orleans were mostly Sicilians, for example, while Italians in San Francisco and in California in general were mostly from northern Italy. Neapolitans and Calabrians became open-pit miners in Minnesota. Immigrants from Turin created an agricultural settlement in North Carolina, and Piedmontese settled in the town of Genoa, Wisconsin. More than half of all the Italians in the United States, however, were concentrated in the Middle Atlantic states in 1910, New York State alone having more than 472,000, and Pennsylvania nearly 200,000. 4/5 were urban. Wherever the early Italian immigrants lived, they tended to live in squalor. Overcrowded and filthy living quarters were common among them, whether in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Milwaukee, Pittsburgh, St. Paul, or in agricultural laborers' camps or at temporary construction sites. Italian laborers also tended to skimp on food, even as compared to other unskilled immigrant laborers, in a desperate effort to save money. Frailty of physique among Italian immigrants was noted at the time, when they were considered less strong than Irish workmen, for example. With the passage of time and the arising of new generations, however, this complaint disappeared. So, too, did the squalor of Italian homes. In later generations, Italian housewives took special pride in the cleanliness of their homes. The occupations of the Italians in the United States during the immigrant era of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were much like those they held in other countries. At least half of all immigrant masons and barbers arriving in the United States were Italians. Fishermen, shoemakers, waiters, and tradesmen were also common among Italian immigrants, and the selling of fruits was a specialty in which Italians became prominent, both in New York and in New Orleans. While not as well represented among skilled occupations in general as the Germans, Britons, or other northern and western European immigrants, Italians were better represented than the Croatians, Slovaks, Magyars, and other southern and eastern European immigrants. Most Italian immigrants, however, were unskilled laborers. As elsewhere, they often worked on construction projects, in mines, and on railroad building projects. Often they succeeded other immigrant groups in these and other manual laboring occupations. Over the years, Italians replaced the Irish as unskilled laborers building railroads and on the New York waterfront. They also replaced the German and Irish workers in the petroleum industry of New Jersey, the Irish, Germans, and Welsh in Pennsylvania's coal mining region, and Jewish workers in New York's clothing industry. As early as 1890, 90% of the employees in New York's public works were Italian. Among 12,500 workers who built the Erie Canal, 10,500 were Italian. They were also predominant among the workers who built trolley lines in large eastern cities and the subways of Boston and New York. Among the relatively few Italians to go into farming in the United States, most were from northern Italy. Of these, the Italian and Italian-Swiss winemakers of California became the best known. Italians also took over abandoned wastelands, requiring great exertions to bring them under cultivation, and often became successful as truck farmers. Occupations requiring education long remained rare among Italians in the United States, printers or newspaper reporters, for example, as well as more exalted professions. As workmen, Italians were noted for their diligence and sobriety, the latter often contrasted with the drinking of the Irish, but also for a lack of initiative that required them to have considerable supervision. The pattern was similar to that noted in Europe during the same era, and was consonant with the docility expected of workers in Italy. Child labor was another Italian pattern brought over from the homeland, and it often interfered with, or even prevented, schooling. Italian women worked more often in the United States than in Italy, though concern for preserving chastity and avoiding even the appearance of laxity in this regard affected what kind of work they did. Work performed in the home, so-called sweatshop labor, was acceptable and common, as it both preserved the reputation of the wife and facilitated work by the children. Operating sewing machines with other women in a clothing factory was also common. However, Italian women tended to avoid working as domestic servants, which could be seen as potentially compromising, especially in an era of live-in maids. Prostitution was virtually unknown among Italian-American women. Like other workers entering a society with a different language and a very different culture, Italians often sought and performed work with a labor contractor of their own nationality and culture. The labor contractor, or padrone, was often from the same province or community in Italy as his workers. He understood both their culture and the business requirements of the American employer, and he spoke both English and Italian. He was more than a middleman, however. The padrone often advanced money to the workmen, transported them to the job site, supervised them at work, took responsibility for their housing and for providing the kinds of food they were used to. These versatile entrepreneurs did not hesitate to protect their investment by maintaining a prison-like control over the workers to whom they had advanced money, including the use of armed guards. Opportunities for defrauding or otherwise taking advantage of new people in a strange land were numerous, and the padrone system provided reformers and newspaper reporters with numerous scandals. However, the continuing use of padroni by the same workers, year after year, suggests that more than ignorance or gullibility was involved. Men with very limited options, and with serious economic exigencies, were able to find work all across the country, in places they had never seen, among people whose language and way of life they could not understand, and ended up with savings vital to themselves and their families. Repeated attempts by reformers to stamp out the padrone system failed, but it began to die out on its own after about 1920, as existing Italian immigrants grew more able to function independently in the United States, and the second-generation Italian Americans had no need for padrone services. Over the years, as Italians rose up the economic scale, they did so largely through acquiring job skills in blue-collar occupations, rather than by becoming educated and entering the professions. Acquiring knowledge of English and literacy enabled many to become low-level civil servants, but few became doctors, lawyers, or intellectuals. Nor did politics attract many, nor prove particularly rewarding for those it did attract. Irish politicians long continued to represent predominantly Italian districts. Even after experienced politicians arose within the Italian-American communities, they could not count on the votes of their countrymen. There was no pan-Italian solidarity in voting, any more than in the many other activities in which Italians remained regionally fragmented in the United States. The first major Italian-American political figure was Fiorello H. LaGuardia, 1882 to 1947, who became first a congressman and then the legendary mayor of New York for more than a decade, from 1934 to 1945. Yet even he failed to carry the Italian vote in his 1941 re-election campaign against an Irish opponent. Along with a general and gradual rise of Italians to higher occupational levels over the decades, there were particular instances of dramatic success. In California, and especially in its fertile Napa Valley, many highly successful winemaking businesses arose among Italians from northern Italy and from Switzerland. Italians also excelled in the production of both fresh and canned fruit. By 1922, a California Italian, Giuseppe Di Giorgio, became the largest fruit grower in the United States. Another, in 1916, formed the company which produced Del Monte brand canned fruits and vegetables, the country's largest seller of canned produce. One of the most remarkable success stories in banking history was that of A.P. Giannini, also a California Italian. He founded the Bank of Italy, an American bank designed to attract Italian immigrants as depositors and borrowers. Being familiar with the culture and the parsimoniousness of his fellow Italians, Giannini was able to do a thriving business by serving a group largely overlooked by conventional American banks. By the middle of the 1920s, the Bank of Italy had branches in many of the urban centers of California. Ultimately renamed the Bank of America, it became the largest bank in the world. Despite the prosperity achieved by Italian Americans in general and the spectacular success of a few, their role in American history has not matched their role in the development of Brazil, and especially Argentina. As one indicator, Italians in the United States played nothing like the leadership role they played in both national labor organizations and national business organizations in Argentina. Italians in Argentina constituted 40% of the labor movement in its early formative years and provided key leaders, while in the United States, Italians tended to lag behind other groups in unionization, and still more so among the early union leaders. Similarly, Italians were prominent among employer organization leadership in Argentina in its formative years, but were wholly unrepresented among the leadership of the National Association of Manufacturers in the United States during its first 20 years. Such differences partly reflected the fact that the United States was a far more developed country when the Italian immigrants arrived, that other immigrants preceded them and collectively outnumbered them greatly, while in both Argentina and Brazil, the Italians were one of two groups that together constituted the bulk of the immigrant population. However, the complete dominance of northern Italians among the most outstanding Italian-American entrepreneurs of the immigrant era, in the wine industry, canning, fresh fruits, and the Bank of America, suggests that the greater representation of northerners among the Italian immigrants in Argentina and Brazil may also be an important factor in the larger role played by immigrants from Italy in those two countries. Within the early labor movements in both these South American countries, for example, northern Italians tended to be leaders more so than southern Italians. In the United States, at about the same time, 40% of the northern Italians were unionized, compared to only 11% of the southern Italians. With both the business and labor history of Italians in the United States, Argentina, and Brazil reflecting regional differences in Italy, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that this is yet another example of historic head starts that had enduring consequences.